guilty of shooting and killing 28-year-old Garrett Foster in July 2020. But Republican Governor Greg Abbott condemned the verdict and said he'd work as swiftly as Texas law allows towards a pardon, adding that Texas has one of the strongest stand-your-ground laws of self-defense that cannot be nullified by a jury. Foster was marching in a Black Lives Matter demonstration when Perry ran a red light and drove into the crowd in downtown Austin. Both men were armed. Protesters surrounded Perry's car and he fired 5 shots, killing Foster. Perry's attorneys argued he shot in self-defense after Foster pointed his gun first, a claim eyewitnesses disputed in court. In the weeks leading up to the violence, Perry had expressed opposition to the nationwide protests. He texted a friend, quote, "I might have to kill a few people on my way to work. They are rioting outside my apartment complex."
This is a legal atrocity. It's so obviously unjust.
Immediately after the conviction, Fox host Tucker Carlson championed Perry's case on his primetime program and pressured Abbott to intervene.
And we wanted to ask if he was considering a pardon for Daniel Perry. But for some reason, Governor Greg Abbott's office told us he just can't make it.
Hours later, the governor announced his request for an expedited review and pardon recommendation by the State Pardon and Parole Board. Today, the county's district attorney asked to present evidence to the Texas Board of Pardons as it considers Abbott's request. Extremism experts warn that Abbott's push to pardon Daniel Perry is part of a larger pattern within the GOP to normalize violence. Joining to discuss is Jeff Charlotte, author of The Undertow: Scenes from a Slow Civil War. He covers the growth of right-wing extremism. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us. You've covered Republicans and the far right for a very long time. What's your reaction to Abbott saying that he supports a pardon for Daniel Perry?
I think what we're seeing here, and I see Abbott's actions on a continuum with the actions of the Tennessee state legislators, some of the actions taken by Ron DeSantis. We're seeing a kind of institutionalization of the far-right violence that some thought came to a peak on January 6th. Instead, it's being pursued by law. And it's now entering into a period in this right-wing movement where it's almost sort of like a mythological age of martyrs, a creation of martyrs. Ashley Babbitt, most famously, I suppose. But now the martyr doesn't even need to have been killed. They simply need to have been persecuted, like the January 6 prisoners or Kyle Rittenhouse or now Daniel Perry.
And I want to get to Rittenhouse and Babbitt, but first, Daniel Perry was very active online. He responded to a tweet that same summer from then-President Donald Trump in 2020 that made thinly veiled threats of violence toward protesters. Perry responded saying, quote, "Send them to Texas." That's just one example of Trump and his supporters normalizing violence, using violent rhetoric. We saw that a lot with January 6. What is the impact of Trump condoning violence like that?
I would say it's more than condoning violence, and it's more than normalizing violence. I think what we have seen emerge in the United States is a political formation for which we can use legitimately and with historical reference the F word, fascism, which is to say it's a kind of celebration of violence. It's more than condoning, but that one finds one true self in violence. And that we see how many, there was I think 72, 73 car ramming attacks on protests in that summer of 2020. We see that in Daniel Perry's almost sort of boasting and what I'm going to do and I'm going to make this attack in the same way that Trump has for so long spoken of violence not as something he regrets but sees as necessary. That would be bad enough, but as something that is almost joyful and perversely pleasurable.
Mm-hmm. And last night, Tucker Carlson on Fox had Kyle Rittenhouse on his program to defend Perry. Rittenhouse fatally shot 2 protesters during George Floyd protests in Wisconsin in 2020, but he was acquitted. That's a difference with Perry. Rittenhouse, though, has become a folk hero on the right. Do you think that Republicans and base voters are going to do the same for Daniel Perry?
I think it's already happened. We've seen Daniel Perry celebrated not just on Tucker Carlson and by Kyle Rittenhouse, by Alex Jones and other leading right-wing figures. We've seen leading QAnon figures embracing Daniel Perry and almost sort of inserting him in again to this sort of this martyr myth, this almost sort of religious feeling of the figures who are they imagine as sort of like Old West heroes, standing their ground, even though, and we don't, I mean, he's already been found guilty, so we don't have to revisit that. But the fact is, Perry himself said right to the police right after the event, I wanted to stop him before he aimed. This wasn't an Old West quick draw. He shot him. There was no aiming. And that, too, I think, is part of the violence that's being celebrated now, to kill a Black Lives Matter protester. A white man who, but as a Black Lives Matter protester, I think in a way is read on the right as part of this threat that they perceive of blackness.
And you've traveled the country, Jeff, talking to Republican voters. Why do you think that they are martyrizing, as you said, people like Kyle Rittenhouse, like Ashley Babbitt, the insurrectionist who stormed the Capitol and was killed by a police officer there, and potentially Perry?
It is a stage, and it's a stage in what Trumpism, which has sort of gravitated from a kind of a prosperity gospel, winning and getting rich, to a kind of conspiracy religion, and now to you need victims, not just the broad victimization of white grievance, but you need specific characters, stories that become central icons around which you can organize and imagine, and into whose stories followers of the movement can project themselves. They can imagine, what would I do if I was in that situation? Just as Daniel Perry was, in a sense, picking up on the actions of those before them. And meanwhile, because I really think we want to connect him to the January 6th, those who are still imprisoned. We saw in Waco that recent Trump rally where he opened not with a national anthem, but with the January 6th choir. So we're replacing political figures with martyr figures. We're replacing traditional rituals with new rituals designed for this new movement. We're replacing the rule of law with this kind of radical states' rights.
Jeff, Charlotte, we got to leave it there, but thank you so much for your time.
And the problem is, it's very hard to see what's wrong with the argument. The argument seems like a good one, and it has seemed that way to everyone who read this paper since 1972. Today we're talking about an absolutely revolutionary paper published by a philosopher named Peter Singer in 1972. The name of the paper is Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And the basic idea is that the moral stance that you have, your attitude towards your moral obligations, and the things that you may or may not do in your life, and the attitude that all of your friends and all of your relatives have, the general moral outlook that everyone around you has, is deeply and profoundly wrong. And the crazy thing about this paper is that, on the surface at least, it's very persuasive. Singer seems to be right. It seems to be, once you go through the argument that he lays out, it seems to be that we need to completely rework our entire society. And more specifically, forget about society for a minute, you need to completely rework your life if your life is going to be a moral one. And sort of what makes the paper so radical is that I can say all of these things, that the thesis of the paper is that you need to completely rework your life, without knowing anything about you. I know virtually nothing about your life and your moral outlook and your values and the kinds of things that you do on a day-to-day basis. I can basically make some assumptions about my audience, general assumptions. You live in a broadly capitalistic society, let's assume. There are government regulations and that sort of thing, and you live sometime in the beginning-ish of the 21st century. That's basically enough. If that's true of you, then Singer thinks that your whole life needs to be reworked if you're going to live in a morally acceptable way. Okay, if we're going to understand this argument, then we need one distinction to start out. This is a technical distinction, but there's really only one technical term. Here you go. We're talking about the distinction between the supererogatory and the obligatory. Imagine this. You're getting together with a group of friends or coworkers or something like that, and you decide, you know what, this is a pretty early gathering. It's a pretty early meeting. And so wouldn't it be nice if I went and got everyone some coffee and danishes? Because some people are going to be rushing out of their house and they're not going to have time to eat breakfast. And so when everyone shows up, surprise, surprise, there is some coffee and donuts and treats or whatever that you brought for everyone. And you paid for. And you're just giving it to them. You say, hey guys, I brought these for you. I want you to have them. That action is supererogatory. It's extra. It's super. You didn't have to do it. but it was a really nice thing to do. It was an extra thing that you did, and it was a good thing to do. It was not obligatory. Something is obligatory if you have to do it, right? So if someone is assigned in the group to bring coffee and breakfast to every early morning meeting, and you signed up, you promised, you committed to bringing coffee and breakfast on that day, well then bringing coffee and breakfast is obligatory. And of course it would be nice if everyone thanked you for bringing those things, even if you agreed or promised to do it. It wasn't extra. It was something you had to do. You had committed to it. You were obliged to do it. One more example just to bring out this distinction. And this example may date this video. It may give you a sense of when I'm making this video. But anyway, at the time of the recording of this video, there's something going on in supermarkets where when you check out in the supermarket and you're paying for your groceries or whatever, well, there's some of the payment is obligatory, right? You have to pay for the things that you are buying. But then there's this extra payment. They say when you're checking out, they're like, would you like to donate $1 to, and then they name some charity. Would you like to add $1 to your bill here at the supermarket? That additional payment, that's extra. You don't have to do it. It's up to you. It's supererogatory. If you do it, it's good. That's a nice thing that you did, right? But you didn't have to. Supererogatory. That's what that word means. Okay, here's the claim of this paper. The claim is that there are these organizations that exist in the world now in 1972, says Singer, right? And these organizations like Oxfam, right, and UNICEF, these are organizations that take money from people who live in relatively wealthy places on the planet, and they take that money and they use it to do amazing things for people who are suffering under things like famines, right? If there's a famine in some place in the world, there's not enough food, and people are literally starving to death. They are dying because they don't have enough food. So someone donates a little bit of money, and these organizations take that money, and a very high percentage of that money with a great deal of efficiency gets transported to this other place on the planet where there's a famine, and literal people's lives are saved. Normally, we, you and I, and all of your relatives and all of your friends, everyone in our society, in our broader society, we think of these sorts of acts, giving charity in this way, giving money to Oxfam or UNICEF or whatever, we think of these things as supererogatory. Giving to charity is supererogatory. It's nice, it's good, but you don't have to do it. If on any given occasion you don't do it, you're not a bad person. It's not like you failed to live up to some obligation that you had. Singer says, no, here's an argument that proves, Singer thinks, that giving to charity, giving extra money to famine relief, if you're affluent, if you have extra money, is something that you must do. You must do it in the same way that you must not murder. Or you must catch someone if they're falling and you can just reach out your arms and catch them and save them. You must do it. That's the thesis. Okay, so Singer has an argument for this thesis, an argument for this conclusion. But we're going to get to the argument in 1 minute. First, let's just skip to the end of the paper and see his statement of that conclusion. Here's what he says. Here's what Singer says. Because giving money is regarded as an act of charity, it is not thought that there's anything wrong with not giving. The charitable man, or if we want, because this was written in 1972, we can say the charitable person. The charitable person may be praised, but the person who is not charitable is not condemned. People do not feel in any way ashamed or guilty about spending money on new clothes or a new car instead of giving it to famine relief. Indeed, the alternative does not occur to them. What's the alternative? The alternative is not getting those new clothes and not getting that new car, and instead taking that money that you would have spent on new clothes and just wearing your old clothes and taking that money and giving it to an organization that will help people, that will save people who are dying of famine, right? That possibility, the possibility of not spending money on luxuries, does not occur to most people or to virtually anyone. This way of looking at the matter cannot be justified. This way of looking at the matter is the way that we all look at the matter. That is, we think that giving money to famine relief is supererogatory. It's nice. It's an extra thing. That cannot be justified. The only thing, according to Singer, that can be justified, and we're going to get to the argument for this conclusion, the only thing that can be justified is the way of thinking where you think that giving to famine relief instead of buying new clothes or a new car or whatever, giving to famine relief is obligatory. That's the only way of thinking that can be justified. The upshot or the punchline is this. If you don't give to famine relief, Singer thinks, you've done something wrong. You've done something evil, bad. Every time you buy new clothes that you don't absolutely need, or you buy a new car when you could just drive your old car, or you buy a cup of coffee that someone else made for you because it's more convenient for them to make it for you and it tastes a little better than if you were to make it at home. Every time you do any of those things, you're doing something wrong. You're doing something bad. We don't think this way. No one in our society, not in 1972, and even though this is a super famous paper, you've maybe never heard of it, and so it didn't seep into the whole society. Even now, right? People don't think that buying new clothes or buying a cup of coffee from a coffee shop is a bad thing to do, an evil thing to do, a wrong thing to do. But Singer thinks that it is, and here's his argument for that conclusion. Okay, here's the argument. Singer doesn't lay out the argument like this with 4 premises and 1 conclusion or anything. I'm pulling these out of the paper, but this is indeed the argument. Here's how it goes. Let's take it one step at a time. 1. If it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything of moral significance, then we must morally do it. That is, prevent that very bad thing from happening. Okay, that's premise 1. I'll just give you a hint. This is going to be the most controversial claim, right? It's a very general claim. It's talking about, very bad things. It's got this big category of very bad things, and then it's got this other category of things with, things that you might sacrifice that are not of moral significance. That's another big category. It's a big grand claim about what you must do morally, and it's a very general claim. So 1 is going to be the most controversial claim in this argument. So we'll come back to this. If you're looking for this claim, by the way, in the reading, then go to page 235. There's one big paragraph in the middle of page 235, and this claim happens, not phrased exactly like this, but basically like this, at the sort of end of that paragraph. Anyway, let's keep going. Step 2. Hunger, disease, and other sources of suffering, disability, and death are very bad. Okay. Those are some examples of very bad things. We see how this is going to connect up with the first premise, right? We've got a bunch of very bad things. And it's said in the first premise that if it's in your power, or if it's in our power to prevent something very bad, well then we've got to do that thing. We've got to prevent those things. So these are going to be the things that we're going to need to prevent, this argument's going to claim. It's just specifying some very bad things. And premise 2, by the way, seems totally plausible. Hunger, disease, and other sources of suffering, disability, and death are very bad. Yes, that's plausible. Hunger is very bad. Real hunger, where someone doesn't have enough food to eat. And disease. And other things that cause people to suffer or become disabled or die. All of that is bad. Yep, okay, good job. Premise 2, very plausible. Premise 3. The luxuries on which we spend money are not of moral significance. So the kinds of luxuries he's talking about are these luxuries, right? Buying new clothes, when your old clothes, although out of fashion, or a little tattered, or whatever, are perfectly good. Or buying a new car, when your old car, although not as good as a new car, is still a good enough car, right? Or the example that I gave earlier, buying a cup of coffee when you could make the coffee at home. Really, going to any restaurant ever, right, counts as a luxury in this sense. I mean, you can always just, for less money, make food at home. This connects with the idea of moral significance, or of some things not being of moral significance, right? sacrificing anything of moral significance. That's part of the first premise also. So premise 3 is specifying the kinds of things that aren't of moral significance. And once we understand what Singer means by luxuries, he's right. These things are not of moral significance. They're not a big deal. If you go without them, you're not really worse off. 4, by donating money to relief agencies like Oxfam, we could prevent hunger, disease, and other sources of suffering, disability, and death. Well, that's just saying that there's a very specific way, an easy way, right, to prevent these things which premise 2 established were very bad. Premise 4, is it true? By donating money to relief agencies like Oxfam, we could prevent hunger, disease, and other sources of suffering, disability, and death. Yes, premise 4 is true. This is true. These organizations do this. You can give them money, and then they will prevent these things. This, premise 4, is just an empirical claim. It's just a claim about whether these organizations actually do the thing that they say they're going to do, and the answer is yes, they do it. Okay, and then here's the conclusion. And we've already reached this conclusion. We've already talked through this conclusion. Therefore, we must. Where is it? Must. We are obligated. It's not supererogatory. It's not extra. This is something you have to do. And so the conclusion gets us something you have to do. We must, morally, donate the money that we spend on luxuries to relief agencies. And we don't get to spend them on luxuries. This is the argument. Okay, so now is a good time to re-emphasize how radical this conclusion is. We're about to assess the argument. We're really going to focus almost entirely on premise 1, because premise 1 is the only controversial premise in the argument. Everything else, steps 2, 3, and 4, I mean, these just seem to be obviously correct, obviously true statements, and the argument is valid. So, well, 1 is the only option that we could argue against, and we're going to try to argue against it, and Singer is going to say, no, none of those arguments work. Okay, but focusing again on the conclusion for a minute before we get back to premise 1, this is pretty radical. No one thinks that we have a moral obligation. None of your friends, none of your family think that you must not buy a cup of coffee. You must not buy a new car. You must not buy new clothes. Instead, you must take all of that money and donate it to some organization like Oxfam, one of these relief agencies. No one lives their life like this, or very few people. Peter Singer, by the way, he's still alive. I met him, right? We had dinner once. He gave a talk, and then I know him. I know celebrities. Peter Singer, who's still alive, kind of lives his life like this. He donates a very significant, non-trivial portion of his income, which is not enormous. It's not an enormous income, to relief agencies. He does this. He does not live a luxurious life, not a life that we would normally call luxurious. Okay, so there's one. And then maybe there's, I don't know, a few of his friends who he convinced. But most people don't live their life like this. The conclusion of this paper is that most people, you included, are doing something bad every day, and you don't even realize it. Okay, enough about how radical this conclusion is or whatever, and how much it departs from your day-to-day life. Let's get to premise 1. This is the controversial premise. What does Singer say to support such a broad, sweeping claim? Here's what he says. This is a rather famous example that Singer gives to support premise 1. Here it is. If I'm walking past a shallow pond and see a child drowning in it, I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this is insignificant, while the death of the child would presumably be a very bad thing. Okay, got the example, right? There's a shallow pond or a fountain. When I teach this class on campus, every college campus, including the one where I work in North Carolina, every college campus has like a fountain somewhere, right? There's a fountain there. A small child is drowning in the fountain and will die. You are walking by. You can easily step in and save the child. The cost to you will be just a few moments, and, well, your clothes are going to get wet or muddy, right? Muddy if it's a pond, or wet if it's a fountain, or whatever. This sacrifice, by the way, is not of moral significance, right? It is insignificant that your clothes are going to get a little wet. Oh, and you're on your way to something where you didn't want your clothes to be wet. Okay, that's not a very significant sacrifice. But the death of the child, the drowning death of the child, in almost all circumstances, would be a very bad thing. Well, the thought is, go from this example. If you agree with what Singer says about this example, and I suggest, of course, that you do. If someone just showed up at a meeting and said, hey, there's this kid drowning, but I didn't want to have wet clothes for this gathering, so I just let the kid drown and die. You would be horrified. You would think that this person was evil, that they had done an evil thing. You would not let your friends or family associate with this kind of person. Well, if you agree with Singer about this specific case, then Singer says we should be able to abstract from this case to a more general principle, and you should hold this more general principle, and the more general principle is premise 1 of the argument. The idea is that, well, a child drowning in a pond, that's a very bad thing, but it's not bad because it has to do with water or children. You know, an adult drowning and dying is also a bad thing, or even an adult dying by some other means is a bad thing, right? What's relevant here is not that it's a child or that it's a water-involving death. It's that this is an easily preventable death. The death is a bad thing. And the fact that your clothes would get muddy, that's a morally insignificant thing. But the fact that it's your clothes and it's mud, that doesn't matter if it's something else that you have to sacrifice. If, for example, instead of your clothes getting wet or muddy, your car is going to get dirty. Or you're going to lose your shoelaces. The shoelaces will be gone forever. You'll have to sacrifice your shoelaces. And you'll have to get whole new shoelaces. And that'll be kind of a pain in the butt. The point is this. The difference between one way of dying and another way of dying, or one morally insignificant sacrifice and another morally insignificant sacrifice, the difference between these doesn't matter. So you can go from a specific case like this to a general claim like 1. And the thought is, if you agree with Singer about this specific case, then you have to accept premise 1 of the argument. Okay, so there are 2 ways in which you might think you can't go from this example to this premise. Or another way to put this point is you might think that there are 2 big differences between this shallow pond example and the example of giving up your luxuries, the luxuries in your life, a new car, a cup of coffee, that sort of thing, a massage. There's a difference between this example and giving up those things to save someone from a famine. There's 2 ways in which there might be a relevant difference. These are the 2 relevant differences that Singer considers and responds to. Here they are. Okay, here's the first potentially relevant difference. Proximity. In the shallow pond example, you're right next to the child. You're very close to this child. Whereas in your day-to-day life, you are not right next to, you're not near the people who are dying of famine or of whatever other very terrible things that organizations like Oxfam fight against. Well, is that?
And the population might decline after that, or might not. And if it does, it'll be because of increased access to contraception and greater educational attainment among women, things like that. And yet, despite this reality, the pro-natalist movement is a growing trend among the wealthy specifically, who appear to be leading by horrifying example. Tech elites Malcolm and Simone Collins, seen here trying to invite you into a Harry Potter-themed threesome, not only want to have as many children as possible, but want their offspring to commit to having at least 8 children each for 11 generations. If that happens, their bloodlines will eventually outnumber the current human population. And that's really fucking creepy, isn't it? Poor little Octavian, Torsten, and Titan Invictus, which other fucking names, are too young to understand this, but they're apparently part of a breeding farm. They have no idea their parents have already loaned out their sperm and uteri. baby sacks. And Lord help them if they grow up not wanting to fulfill their weird destiny. But of course, while their stated motivation is this myth of a declining population, it's important to note that these pronatalists are only pro-reproduction for people like them. They might not explicitly say that, but for example, here's Elon Musk praising the opening of Idiocracy that, if you recall, imagines a world where evolution is, quote, dumbed down because only poor, non-intelligent people have kids. Musk has said in interviews that the three biggest indicators for having lots of children are poverty, lack of education, and religion. So if you're like a powerful capitalist who treats his workers poorly and views anyone who disagrees with you as a non-person and who bought an information-sharing website and who has out loud said he supports the party of religious zealotry and corporate greed, one can kind of see a pretty clear picture that he seems to want to have a bunch of secret, wealthy, super smart babies to lead the army of poor, religious, misinformed masses to shape the future as he sees fit. Just a little theory based on his words and actions. Anyway, here's another much more bizarre example of tech billionaire Mark Andreessen, who's blocking on Twitter for some reason, I don't know why, warning that chatbots and VR waifus will mean that only the most aggressive men and women will breed and send us back to the Bronze Age. You know how the best and smartest people are the ones susceptible to fucking virtual waifus? Powerful insight, Mr. Andreessen. Only a truly great mind could be the co-founder of Netscape, the absolutely not the first web browser ever made. Funny how these people seem to think every invention before the internet was natural selection, and somehow only now are we screwing that up. And of course, there's another word for what these weird freaks are describing, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, based on the very simple definition of eugenics, which is manipulating the gene pool to promote superior characteristics, and I put that in quotation marks, that is their belief, that's what this is. And in fact, some of the people involved in these movements don't even deny that. They'll freely use the word eugenics.
Right. They may not say it publicly in so many words, but eugenics is absolutely what we're circling here. Musk and others like him are very dedicated to the idea that wealth is directly linked to IQ, and that it's more important than ever for rich people like him to have a lot of children. So weird how an IQ test developed by a bunch of racist and wealthy eugenicists would constantly result in a bunch of pro-eugenics conclusions. So darn weird. Why? Oh, but even if IQ tests were accurate, which they aren't, it's still not true that wealthy people have higher IQs. And so none of this aligns with Elon Musk's claim that he cares about the future of humanity so much as it shows that he cares about the future of humanity and the future of certain other people. I'm not going to call him a white nationalist, for legal reasons, but there's a simple through line from Musk encouraging rich people to procreate to Viktor Orban's policies aimed at promoting growth of traditional families to the Christchurch New Zealand mass shooter starting his manifesto with "It's the birth rates, it's the birth rates, it's the birth rates." Again, not saying that all rich people are Nazis. Seriously not saying that. But you see how easy it could be for a person with little consideration for others and overconfidence in their own value to conclude that their DNA must be superior and then get wrapped up in this kind of thinking, like Nazi thinking. Also, it helps if you grew up in an apartheid. But I'm not naming any names. Right? I'm absolutely not naming any stupid, insecure, overwhelmingly divorced names. And this creepy eugenics hogwash seems to stem from a larger ethical position known as long-termism. As the name implies, long-termism emphasizes that society should make decisions based on the long-term consequences for humanity, focusing on the lives of people generations from now, or even thousands or millions of years in the future. Okay, sure. So I assume that they think we need to prioritize the mitigation of climate change, avert nuclear war, and ensure an adequate social safety net for the long haul, right? Except it turns out that's not what they care about at all. We've talked about this before on a smaller scale because it comes up a lot when talking about tech people like Elon Musk. Invention is, as you might know, the mother of needing stuff. When Wordy McWordsmaker invented the first printing press, they weren't thinking about how to create the internet several thousands of years from then. Why would they? They were solving an immediate problem in their society. But something has broken in these tech people's brains where they keep trying to invent things based on what their own vision of the future should be, instead of what people actually need. Neuralink, Musk's monkey torturing company, claims it can eventually use brain chips to help people with disabilities. And yet, when grilled on this by a respected medical expert, Elon seems to have no idea how that would actually work.
What is happening that's allowing it to do that? Like the wires, these small wires, stimulating these areas of the brain, and then is it that the areas of the brain are they're losing some sort of electrical force? Like what is happening?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like I think it's like a bunch of circuits, and there's some like circuits that are broken, and we can fix those circuits, substitute for those circuits.
You see, it'll shock your brain or something. Now it'll fix it. It's like that. It's like whatever you just said to me. You guess, and then the answer is like, yeah, it's kind of like that. Because that, of course, isn't what Musk actually created the company for. He created Neuralink because he wants to achieve a transhuman evolution where our brains are wired into the world like a computer. Oh, we can play Tetris in our minds. Neuralink's first product isn't designed to help someone with a disability, but to let us control our smartphones with brain chips. And do we really need that? We can already control smartphones with our voices or fingers, and there are, of course, accessibility barriers for some people regarding that. But that's not why he's doing it. He's doing it because he thinks it's like a neat little sci-fi gizmo. He's thinking about his sci-fi dream and working backwards. And because he's so hungry for that result, he's likely going to cut corners, and in fact, might end up achieving nothing beyond some fried monkey brains. That isn't to say brain chips won't happen, but it will more likely be made by somebody else who is actually focused on treating the immediate need. People with brain diseases or mobility issues that will be helped by a chip. And that really sums up long-termism, the idea that we need to focus on some far-off utopian fantasy to the point that we ignore or even abuse the world right in front of us. After all, what's a few dead monkeys or 1,500 other dead animals or massive worker layoffs or even a climate catastrophe when the goal is to have space colonies and immortalize the human race? And they really do fantasize about living in space. They even have a spot picked out in the form of the collection of galaxies called the Virgo supercluster. As former long-termism adherent Emil P. Torres writes, the suffering of those living today would be minuscule compared to the potential benefit, as they see it, of having 10 to the 23rd biological humans living pleasure-filled lives throughout the Virgo supercluster. So we're clear, 10 to the 23rd is a 1 followed by 23 zeros. And so, of course, this all ties into the breeding fantasy. Because to them, one of the best ways to reach that utter sci-fi nonsense is to pump out a bunch of rich kids. Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom, a major influence on the long-termists, writes of dysgenic pressures in the current world, as in undesirable characteristics that should be bred out. Quote, it is possible that advanced civilized society is dependent on there being a sufficiently large fraction of intellectually talented individuals. Currently, it seems that there's a negative correlation in some places between intellectual achievement and fertility. He goes on to say that genetic engineering is rapidly approaching the point where it will become possible to give parents the choice of endowing their offspring with genes that correlate with intellectual capacity, physical health, longevity, and other desirable traits. Always great when someone talks about desirables and undesirables. In short, these are people who watched Gattaca and completely misunderstood the message of it. I'm not editorializing. I'm not saying this just so we can show you that sick poster. Quote from that pronatalist couple, the Collinses. We are the underground railroad of Gattaca babies and people who want to do genetic stuff with their kids. Literally name dropping the cautionary film Gattaca as their goal. It really can't be stressed enough how unself-aware they are about any of this. As when asked about the pronatalist movement, Malcolm Collins told the National Post, imagine if there really were some secret cabals of rich dudes trying to just make more of themselves. Wouldn't that be outrageous and wild? Ah, yes. Wouldn't that be wild? These weird rich freaks want to